Hello, welcome to the second section of the course, Implementing Complex User Interfaces. In this section, we'll start by creating a reusable button, then build a complex layout for tablets, then move to include custom fonts for iOS and Android, then proceed further to use font icons. After using font icons, we'll deal with universal apps and detect the orientation changes. Then we'll use WebView and render simple HTML elements, and finally learn to create a form component. Now we move on to the first video of this section, creating a reusable button with theme support. In this video, we'll first import the dependencies and create a button component, then define the class for the component, and finally export the styles. Reusability is very important when developing software. We should avoid repeating the same thing over and over again, and instead we need to create small components that we can reuse many times as needed. While going through this video, we'll learn how to use props and how to dynamically apply different styles to a component. As we did in the last section, we first need to create an empty app using the React Native CLI. Let's name it Custom Components. Feel free to use any other name, just make sure to use the same name later when required. In an empty app, we need to create a source folder at the root level of our project. Inside this folder, we need a JavaScript file called main.app.js. We also need one more folder called button, with index.js and styles.js files. This is our folder structure. Next, we'll be importing the dependencies for our new component. In this case, we'll create a button component. Therefore, we'll need the text, touchable opacity, and view components. If we would like to add support for icons, we should import the image components as well. But to keep things simple, we're not going to cover that now. We'll define the styles in a different file later, but for now, let's just import them all. Open the index.js file and add the code. Here we're using the touchable opacity component. This component allows us to define a nice animation that changes the opacity when the user presses the button. Now that we have our dependencies imported, let's define the class for this component. We're going to need some properties, and two methods only. We'll be using the getTheme and render method. It's also required that we export this component so we can use it elsewhere. Let's define the properties for this component. The children property will receive all the children components defined for the button, which means we can use images as well. We're going to define some Boolean configurations for the styles, like, danger, info, and success. All are assigned a Boolean value. When true, we'll assign the appropriate styles to the button. The style prop will receive additional styles for the main container. This will make our new component more flexible. The onPress prop will receive a callback function that will be executed when the user presses the button. We now need to select the styles to apply to our component based on the given props. For this, we'll define the getTheme method. This method will check if any of the props are true and will return the appropriate styles. Otherwise, it will return the default style. It's required that all components have a render method. Here we need to return the JSX elements for this component. In this case, we'll get the styles for the given props and apply them to the touchable opacity component. This is the touchability code. We're also defining a label for the button. Inside this label, we'll render the children prop. If a callback function is received, then it will be executed when the user presses the component. We can use the active opacity property to set the opacity value when the button gets pressed. The value can be any number between 0 and 1, where 0 is completely transparent. We're almost done with our component, but styles are still missing. So first, let's work on the main.app.js. We need to import the dependencies as well as the button component we've created. We're going to display an alert message when the user clicks the button. Therefore, we need to import the alert component. This component works on iOS and Android. Once we have all the dependencies, let's define a stateless component that renders a few buttons. This is the code which we'll be using. The first button will use the default theme. The second button will use the success styles, which we'll style with a nice green color as a background. The last button will display an alert when it's pressed. For that, we need to define the callback function that will only use the alert component. Here, we'll just set the title and the message. We're going to use some styles for each button. We just need to add a margin. This is the margin for the button. Now we need to register our app in the index.ios.js and index.android.js files. This is the code. Use the same code for index.android.js. If we try to run the app now, we'll get some errors. This is because we haven't declared the styles of our button. Let's work on that now. Inside the style.js file, we need to define the base styles. These styles will be applied to every instance of the button. Here we'll define a radius, padding, font color, and all the common styles that we need for this component. Once we have the common styles for our button, we need to define the styles for the danger, info, success, and default themes. For that, we're going to define different objects for each theme, and then inside each theme we will use the same object but with specific styles for that theme. To keep things simple, we're only going to change the background color, but we do have the option to use as many style properties as needed. Finally, let's export the styles. This is necessary because in the button component we're importing the common styles as well as all the available themes. Let's run the code on the emulator. This is our output. If we press the last button, we'll see a native alert message as shown. We get the same alert in Android. That was nice. In this video, we created a reusable button with theme support. In the next video, we'll build complex layout for tablets.